Hi, this is Andy Babiuk, and I'm in my shop, Fab Gear in Rochester, New York, and I'm here to talk about my long-term friendship with Fred and Dinah Gretsch and the Gretsch Company. I first met Fred in the early 90s. It was around the time when he bought the Gretsch brand back from Baldwin, and I was super excited to find out that Gretsch guitars were once again being built.
My time flies because our relationship goes back to 1990 when we first met, Andy, when you were a buyer in a music store there in Rochester, and we were there to sell you Gretsch guitars. Of course, Gretsch guitars were out of the market from about 1980 to 1990 and brought them back in 1990, and you were one of our first customers there when we brought Gretsch guitars back into the marketplace.
It was in the mid-90s when I was working on the research for Beatles gear that Fred was really super helpful. He was really happy to share all kinds of information about Gretsch and his experiences with Gretsch. He started working there when he was a teenager, driving the delivery truck and delivering Gretsch guitars to 48th Street. And they always wanted more Gretsch guitars because of the Beatles.
I started in Brooklyn full-time March of '65. It was the Beatles era, of course. The business was so strong, you had to wait 6 months before we could fill your order for a Gretsch guitar.
He told me how he saw the Beatles in 1964 in New York City at Forest Hills Tennis Stadium. He was a big Beatles fan himself. He also told me a great story on how the Traveling Wilburys were doing a record, and George Harrison contacted him about doing a special Traveling Wilburys model. He went on to tell me that he went to go visit George at his home in England, and he actually presented him with a brand new Gretsch Country Gentleman, which I thought was really cool. Fred also introduced me to Duke Kramer. Now, Duke was an employee of Gretsch going back as far as 1935. Now, Duke was a super wealth of information, and he was telling me great stories. One of the guys he really talked a lot about was Jimmy Webster. Jimmy Webster was a New York City musician who was a guitarist, a really great guitarist. He brought a lot of new innovative ideas into Gretsch. Jimmy came up with cool innovative things like the Silver Jet, some of the cool car colors like Cadillac Green, Jaguar Tan, all kinds of really cool stuff. He's the guy who actually signed Chet Atkins and came up with the 6120. And of course, Jimmy's crown jewel, it was he that came up with the White Falcon. My book Beatles Gear was published in November 2001, and Fred called me up to congratulate me. He thought the book was really well researched and well written, and at one point he actually sent me a signed copy of my own book. In the book there was a page with one of Fred's quotes. On that page Fred wrote, "Andy, in the history of rock and roll, you take a place in capturing one of its brightest times. Best wishes, Fred Gretsch." And I thought that was a great honor coming from Fred. A few months later, I ran into Fred at the 2002 NAMM show, and Fred was telling me how he had made a deal with Fender to distribute and manufacture Gretsch guitars. And he also told me that in 1999, Gretsch had purchased Bigsby. And he said that Ted McCarty called him and thought that Gretsch should be the only place that should own Bigsby because there was that long history, and of course we all know there's all those Bigsby vibratos that say Gretsch by Bigsby. During that same conversation, Fred told me again how much he really liked the Beatles gear book, and then he asked me to write a book on Bigsby. I was really tied up with my band, the Chesterfield Kings, at the time, and I told him, I'll consider it, I just don't have the time. You know, I'll keep it in the back of my head. The following year, I ran into Fred again at the NAMM show, and he approached me and said, "Are you ready to write the Bigsby book?" And I just was really tied up with my band still. Plus, I had already agreed with my publisher to write the Rolling Stones gear book, which I had already started researching and writing. So I just didn't have the time to work on the Bigsby book for Fred. Fred would regularly call me and we'd chat on the phone. It was always great to talk to Fred. At one point, he actually flew up to Rochester and took myself and my wife Monica out to dinner so he could discuss the concept of doing a Bigsby book. Well, I'll tell you what, Fred's diligence worked really well. By October of 2006, I agreed to write the Paul Bigsby book, and it's the story of Paul Bigsby building the first solid body electric guitar. It was while working on the Bigsby book that I got to really know Fred. We used to talk on the phone all the time. It was during this period that Fred was stressing that he wanted it to be a top-notch book, best quality, not just printing, photography, everything. We developed a great relationship. It was while I was working on the Bigsby book that Randy Bachman called me. He had the largest collection of Gretsch guitars and he wanted me to help him sell it. So I suggested to Randy, why don't you call Fred Gretsch? And so the two of them talked. It was soon after that, Fred called and said that they would like to hire me to actually assess the whole collection. Before you know it, it's January of 2008, and I'm at Randy's island home, and I'm going through like 400 Gretsch guitars. I was there for a week, 8 hours a day. Randy and I had a ball. We were looking at all kinds of cool stuff, and Randy had great stories on how he collected all the stuff from his days in the Guess Who and Bachman Turner Overdrive. It was just a lot of fun, but then I had to take all that information home back to New York, and I had to write it all up, present it to him, and give him all the documentation for Fred and him to review. So after I finished all the documentation, I sent it over to Fred and Randy, and then their lawyers started working out a deal to have the Gretsch Foundation buy the complete Randy Bachman Gretsch collection. While working on the Bigsby book, I got to know Tom Bresch. Tom Bresch was the son of Merle Travis. Merle Travis had the first solid body Bigsby guitar, but he also had a Martin D28 that Bigsby replaced the neck and put a Bigsby neck on it with the Bigsby headstock with the 6-on-a-side tuners. We photographed that guitar for the Bigsby book, and there was some point that I was talking to Tom and I said, hey, it'd be really cool if you do a reissue of this guitar. Maybe Martin could build this guitar and do a replica of your dad's guitar. It'd be really nice. Tom thought it was a great idea, so I put him in touch with Dick Boak, who was in charge of artist relations at the C.F. Martin Company. It was about a couple months later that Dick called me up about something unrelated. We were talking, and then I mentioned to him, I said, hey, how's that Merle Travis D28 project going with the Bigsby headstock? It's at a halt. We could make the guitar, he told me, an exact replica of it, but the problem is we don't have the rights to use the name Bigsby. And I said, that's easy. Fred Gretsch owns the rights to Bigsby, and I'm working on a book with him, about Bigsby right now. I'm sure that if we get Fred on the phone with Chris, they could probably make a deal. And I knew Chris is a really cool guy too, because I've known Chris for a long time. And I just thought, let's just get the two of them on the phone. Well, that happened, and soon enough, the two of them made a deal, and Martin ended up releasing the guitar as a limited edition Merle Travis D28 with the Bigsby headstock. These were cool guitars that were all signed by Chris Martin, Fred Gretsch, and Tom Bresch. In 2017, there was another Bigsby D28 that came out very limited, and it was also one of the few times that the Martin Company actually put the name Bigsby or another manufacturer's name on a Martin guitar. All in all, I thought it was really cool to have Fred Gretsch and Chris Martin work together and create a cool guitar, and it's honoring Merle as a killer guitar player and a legend that he is. Fred Gretsch Enterprises published The Story of Paul Bigsby, father of the modern electric solid body guitar. It came out as a hardcover book and also a limited edition deluxe version that came in a beautiful clamshell box embossed with the Bigsby logo. Fred and I would continue to work together on a lot of different projects, including publishing. As various versions of Beatles gear came out, we would often do limited edition Gretsch versions of the book. I've been in the music retail industry since 1979. And by 2009, I opened up my own shop, Andy Babiuk's Fab Gear, which we're in now. One of the very first lines we got was the Gretsch brand. I was so proud to be able to sell Gretsch guitars in my own shop finally. At the time, a very dear friend of mine, Jeff Carey, was Senior Vice President at FMIC, Fender Musical Instrument Company, for specialty brands. That included Gretsch guitars. Jeff and I go back a long ways, back to the 80s. Jeff used to live here in Rochester. He's a super talented musician, but great engineer. He actually engineered a bunch of Chesterfield Kings records that we did. So we go back a long ways. So when Jeff took the job at Fender, we'd stay in touch by phone all the time. He'd pick my brain about different ideas about Gretsch. I remember one time visiting Jeff at the FMIC headquarters with my friend Ed Rowland from Collective Soul. During that meeting, we were hanging out with Joe Carducci, and Joe was showing us some brand new prototypes of the soon-to-come-out white Falcon acoustic 6-string and 12-string. Joe and I were throwing around a lot of ideas. We had gone over a cool Rancher Dreadnought that was going to have a new Gretsch pickup in the neck position. It's soon to be named the Fidelitron. After we had gone through a bunch of different ideas, Joe said, hey, do you have any other ideas that we could do for Gretsch? And I thought, what if we put a Bigsby on an acoustic guitar? I can't remember it ever being done before. It might be really cool. Joe Carducci looked at Jeff Carey and he says, you know what? It's sick and it's wrong. We gotta do it. It's totally Gretsch. So Jeff Carey picks up the phone and calls Donnie Wade. Now, Donnie was one of the heads of the research and development at Fender, coming up with new prototypes. And so he calls him down to the office. Now, I had just met Donnie earlier that day, a couple hours earlier. Donnie's this really cool guy, great luthier, and he told me this cool story on how when he was younger, when he lived in Texas, he actually hitchhiked all the way to Downey, California just to meet Paul Bigsby. He loved the Bigsby book. He was telling me how much he really loved it and how much he loved Paul Bigsby and how much Paul Bigsby had inspired him to be a luthier. Well, anyhow, Donnie comes walking into Jeff's office and Jeff tells him, Andy's got this idea. Could we put a Bigsby on an acoustic guitar? Donnie Wade, in his very heavy Texas accent, says, no fucking way. You can't put a Bigsby on an acoustic guitar. No fucking way. And I'm like, oh no. I go, come on, Donnie. You could do it. If there's anyone in the world that could do it, you're a killer luthier. You could do it. And I said, Donnie, now listen. Paul Bigsby would try to do it. And I think something clicked when I said Paul Bigsby, because he kind of calmed down and he said, well, let me take a look at this. It was about a year and a half later that I go to the NAMM show and I see a Bigsby loaded acoustic guitar, beautiful guitar. Jeff Carey told me at that NAMM show, he said, listen, we kind of didn't know how this guitar was going to go over. We thought, it's kind of a far out thing. So his initial order run for the guitar, he did it very conservative. Jeff told me at that same NAMM show, every dealer that walked in and saw that guitar ordered it, they way under ordered and they had to triple the order that they initially did. And it's a model that still continues to this day. Now, I ran into Donnie about a year or two after that. We were chatting about a lot of stuff. And he said he was really happy to actually do that guitar and he was happy to see it come out. He did tell me that he had to do 16 prototypes to get it right, because the angle that he had to do the neck to the body, and he actually had to arch the flat top of the guitar just to get the Bigsby to work. I'm so happy Donnie did it. Jeff Carey and I would continue to have our great talks on the phone, catching up on things, and also talking about Gretsch. At some point he had asked me, he goes, hey, what do you think about the Gretsch bass line? And of course, being a bass player, I had some ideas. One of the things I was zeroing in on was the pickup. And I asked Jeff, hey, could you let me design a pickup for you? So we chatted about that. Somewhere during the conversation, Jeff told me, he goes, you know, we also got to find a really cool guy that could endorse Gretsch basses, you know, cool rock and roll guy. So that idea was in the back of my head. It was soon after that my wife Monica saw that Cheap Trick was playing near Rochester here and she wanted to go. And I've known Cheap Trick from the 70s. Good friends. I've known Robin and Tom and Rick. Great guys. So I call up Tom and I said, you know, we want to come down and visit. And so we went down to visit them at the show. They were great as always. And I think after the show we were talking, hanging out. And Tom said, you know, I play these 12-string basses and I've worked with smaller companies, but I would really love to work with a bigger company. And he asked me, you know Fred Gretsch, right? And I said, well, yeah, of course I do. He goes, I would love to work with somebody like Gretsch. And I said, I know what to do. So that was a Saturday. The next morning, Sunday, I call up Jeff Carey at home and I said, Jeff, you know how you wanted a poster boy for Gretsch, for basses? I said, what about Tom Peterson from Cheap Trick? He said, wow, really? So I told Jeff the whole story. Before you know it, Tom and I are down in Scottsdale at Fender headquarters working on a new 12-string Tom Peterson model. It was around that time that I decided to put my band, the Chesterfield Kings, on hiatus, and I started a new band. It's called the Empty Hearts, and it featured Elliot Easton from the Cars on lead guitar, Clem Burke from Blondie on drums, and Wally Palmer from the Romantics on lead vocals and rhythm guitar. And I was the bass player. All the members in the Empty Hearts really loved Gretsch guitars, and as a matter of fact, we actually appeared at the Gretsch booth at one of the NAMM shows. Elliot Easton, of course, had his own signature Elliot Easton Gretsch model. Wally Palmer, as a matter of fact, on their famous hit, the Romantics, What I Like About You, he actually plays a Gretsch Tennessean on it. I played a white Falcon that was custom built for me by Steve Stearns, and it had the pickup that I designed in it called the Rumbletron, really hot bass pickup. The Empty Hearts toured in the fall of 2014 to promote our new album. We toured here in the States and in Japan. And I think one of the last shows we did on the tour was in New York City in Times Square at BB King's. I remember we were doing the sound check and my phone rings and it's Fred. Fred had told me that he and Dinah were in town in Manhattan and they wanted to come and visit us. They had to fly out that night, but they still wanted to come and visit us, and they did. I was so impressed the fact that Fred just came to hang out and say hello, and it's always great to see Fred and Dinah. Joe Carducci called me in the early part of 2015 and asked if the Empty Hearts would perform at a special celebration honoring Fred Gretsch being in the music industry for 50 years. Of course we said yes, and we were happy to play. That evening there was a special dinner at a country club in Brooklyn. We were having a really good time, champagne was flowing, and at some point our drummer Clem Burke decided we should write a Christmas song and record it. So next thing you know, Clem's playing a Bo Diddley beat on the table and singing this song that he came up with. Well, there were candles on the table and there was a centerpiece, very elaborate. The centerpiece falls over, starts on fire, and it was just crazy. It was a lot of fun. I guess you just can't take a rock and roll band to a formal dinner. Somewhere towards the end of 2015, Fred called me and asked if I would help out with a special exhibit that would be going up at the Country Music Hall of Fame of all the Gretsch guitars that Gretsch had purchased from Randy Bachman. I, of course, said yes. Immediately flew down to Nashville, Tennessee, lent a hand with the museum. Jeff Carey met me there also, and we worked with the museum to help put together the exhibit that went up. The American Sound and Beauty Guitars from the Bachman Gretsch Collection exhibit opened early in 2016. To celebrate the Gretsch exhibit that was at the Country Music Hall of Fame, the summer 2016 NAMM show had a really cool celebration, and the Country Music Hall of Fame asked me to come down and do an audiovisual presentation of my Beatles gear book. During that same event, Tom Peterson, who also lives in Nashville, came to the presentation, and he and myself and Jeff Carey did an unveiling of Tom's cool new 12-string Gretsch bass, as well as the 4-string bass that's also the Tom Peterson signature model. Tom and I talked quite a bit while they were working on the prototypes of his instruments, as well as when Steve Stearns was building my custom version of the White Falcon bass. We talked about a lot of different features on the guitar, but we never really talked about the size of the body. Now, when they were building the Tom Peterson basses, and Steve Stearns was also building my custom version of the White Falcon bass, we compared a lot of notes, Tom and I, but we never compared the body size. It wasn't until we brought all our instruments together in Nashville that we realized that Tom had picked a 6120 body and I had picked a Country Gentleman body, which is a slightly bigger, and that was the first time we realized that they were just slightly different. It didn't really matter because they all looked really cool. Fred, of course, was at the event also, and it was the first time that I could show Fred my White Falcon bass that had the single pickup that I had designed, which at that point Joe Carducci named the Rumbletron. At some point a few years earlier, Fred had asked me to write the definitive Gretsch book, and I really seriously considered it. Fred wanted it to be the complete history, guitars, drums, the whole history, and I actually sat down and sketched out what needed to be done and how long it would take. And it's just a mammoth task, and I just didn't have the time to do it. I had to honestly tell Fred, I don't have the time, Fred, and this is a massive task that has to be done, but it has to be done correctly. Every time I'd see Fred, he'd always ask me, Andy, do you have the time to write the Gretsch book? And I'd always have to respectfully say to him, I just don't have the time, Fred. I believe it was NAMM 2017 that I ran into Fred again at the NAMM show with my son Andrew and Victoria, who both work here at Fab Gear. And Fred had invited us to a private dinner that he was having that evening. Of course we went, and it was a beautiful little Italian restaurant. At the table were the heads of Terada, the manufacturers of Gretsch guitars from Japan. People like TV Jones, the pickup manufacturer that makes the wonderful Gretsch pickups. Fred put me seated right next to Dwayne Eddy. Now, it was a magical night for me because Dwayne and I spent pretty much the whole night talking about guitars. Dwayne had great stories. It was just a magical evening for me because I'm a huge fan. Somewhere during the night, Dwayne pulled out his phone and he showed me a prototype that Gretsch had built for him. It was a new Dwayne Eddy 6-string bass with the Bigsby on it. He told me he wanted an instrument that he could reproduce a sound that he got on all his famous old records, and he was very proud of it. Dwayne told me that he was really excited about this cool bass, and he was even more excited that they actually were going to release it as a limited edition model at the NAMM show the following year. Well, at that NAMM show, that was one of the first things I looked for in the Gretsch booth. And I'm gonna tell you, I couldn't put the thing down. I plugged it into an amp. I couldn't stop playing it. And if you know anything about NAMM, you have an appointment every about half hour. I was late for appointments. I didn't care. I just had to play this thing. It was so cool. I think we ordered 5 or 6 of them from my shop here at Fab Gear, and it is just a killer guitar. Jeff Carey had introduced me to Jason Barnes in 2014, who at the time was product manager for Gretsch. Jason's a great guy, talented musician, killer guitar player, but the thing about Jason is he actually understands what the end consumer wants. We hit it off right away. Really great guy. We would often talk about different Gretsch ideas. One time during one of our conversations, I had brought up the idea of the Duo Jet. The original Bigsby guitar, which was done in 1948 from Merle Travis, was a similar look to the Duo Jet, which historically speaking, Gibson kind of took that idea, came out with the Les Paul in 1952, and in 1953, Gretsch came out with the Duo Jet. So my point to Jason was, listen, this is a really important guitar, not only for the Gretsch line, but historically. And if any manufacturer has the right to build a guitar that has that look, Gretsch has the history. It goes back to 1953. What I was telling Jason was, there's a couple things that should probably be done to the guitar to bring it to the modern player. And one of the things that I pointed out to Jason was to do a pickup that was a little fatter sounding, given more of a humbucker sound, though it was a humbucker, but just something a little thicker, but yet retaining that bright, sparkling Gretsch tone. Jason agreed, and he ended up working with his team and coming up with a really cool pickup. It was during one of my visits to Scottsdale, Arizona, when I was visiting Jeff Carey at the FMIC Fender headquarters, that Jason asked me to stop by his office. He wanted to show me something. So I go down and visit Jason, and he's got a new prototype Jet model sitting there on a stand. First thing I do is I look at the pickup, and I notice it's slightly bigger, and I go, hey man, you did it. You made the pickup bigger. He told me, you know, Andy, pretty much everybody here at Fender plays guitar. I've showed this same guitar to a lot of the different guys here, and none of them noticed that this Filtertron is larger than the normal Filtertron. Tim Shaw is the guy who did the pickup. They had to do a lot of prototypes, and apparently to get the sound, they needed to make the bobbin larger to fit more wire on it. Hence, they had to come up with a new casing to cover the pickup, which actually made the pickup larger. On that same prototype was a real cool feature that I noticed right away, and that was the tailpiece. Now, traditionally, a stop tailpiece is just a straight bar straight across. This particular prototype, the tailpiece was in a V formation. So I asked Jason, I said, who came up with that idea? And he says, well, I thought of it because I was looking at the Cadillac tailpiece and I thought that'd be kind of cool to make it a little different. And then he also told me that he wanted the Gretsch guitar to stick out. If someone was playing a Jet guitar on a stage and you're way back in the crowd, you could see just from the tailpiece that it's a Gretsch guitar. I thought that was brilliant of Jason, and that also confirmed to me that Jason was 100% the right guy at Gretsch. At my shop here, Andy Babiuk's Fab Gear, we're really proud of the fact that we promote and sell Gretsch guitars. We're actually super proud that we're actually one of the Gretsch elite dealers. There's very few of us in the country. So with the 140th anniversary of Gretsch, I wanted to do something really special. Now, Jason Barnes and I had talked about doing a limited model for Fab Gear in the past, but for the 140th year, I thought this would be a perfect time to do it. So I called Jason and we went back and forth with a lot of ideas, and we came up with a model that I'm very proud of. It's called the Fab Gear Broadkaster Jr. It features a beautiful flame top cherry sunburst finish. It has mahogany back and sides. It has really nice hump inlays on the fingerboard. I'm also proud of the fact that the headstock has a plate on it that says the Fab Gear Broadkaster. It's also labeled as the Fab Gear model on the inside label of the guitar. And it sounds amazing, and it just looks stellar. I've known Fred and Dinah Gretsch for over 30 years now, and I have to say one thing. They're actually the nicest, kindest people you could ever meet. I mean, like, every birthday, I get a handwritten card from them, Christmas cards, invitations to parties, you name it, and I kept all of it. When I run into Fred at a NAMM show, he'd always have a little souvenir pin commemorating something, always some small little gift, and I've kept it all. I really cherish that stuff because every time I talk to Fred, he always asks about all my kids. He remembers all their names. He remembers my grandkids' names. Fred told me a long time ago, it was probably around the time that we were working on the Bigsby book. He said, you know, Andy, there are close friends that we have that we consider part of the Gretsch family, and I consider you and your family part of the Gretsch family. He told me that same thing quite a few times since that, and every time he does, I always think to myself, it's a real honor to know Fred and Dinah Gretsch. They are true friends. Gretsch has an amazing legacy, and I'm really privileged to be part of the Gretsch family and be able to sell Gretsch guitars here at my shop, Fab Gear. All I could say is, long live Gretsch.